I came home from work and found the HOA president hanging wet laundry across my backyard fence again. Not once, not accidentally. Every single day. Water dripped down cedar panels I'd spent nearly $3,000 restoring the previous summer. And Patricia Collins acted like my property belonged to the entire neighborhood. At first, I tried being reasonable. I asked her politely to stop using the fence because the moisture was damaging the wood. The next morning, the laundry came back anyway. 3 days later, I found a bright Orange HOA violation notice taped to my front door. Exterior maintenance issue. Fence discoloration visible from adjacent lots. Fine. $150 per week. That's when I realized something. The HOA president genuinely believed she could damage my property, then punish me for complaining about it. Unfortunately for Patricia, I'd already started reading Maple Ridge's architectural bylaws before responding. And buried deep inside Section 8.3 was a rule she clearly assumed nobody would ever notice. So I stopped arguing completely. A week later, half the neighborhood stood outside watching wet towels, jeans, and bedsheets slide straight off my fence and fall face first into the mud while Patricia completely lost control of the situation. Maple Ridge Estates looked like the kind of neighborhood real estate agents loved showing in brochures. Perfect sidewalks. Fresh mulch around every mailbox. Matching street lamps that turned on automatically at sunset. The HOA even paid a landscaping company to edge the curbs twice a month, so the streets always looked unnaturally clean. When I bought the house 3 years earlier, that kind of order honestly appealed to me. Before Maple Ridge, I'd spent almost 15 years bouncing between apartment complexes around Columbus, thin walls, parking lot arguments at midnight, upstairs neighbors stomping around at 2 in the morning. By the time my divorce finalized, I wanted one thing more than anything else: quiet. That was the entire reason I bought the place. Nothing fancy, just a modest 2-story brick house with a decent backyard, and enough privacy to sit outside, without hearing somebody screaming through an apartment wall. I worked long HVAC shifts 6 days a week, especially during Ohio summers, and after dealing with broken compressors and angry customers all day, peace mattered more to me than square footage. The fence became part of that peace almost immediately. Technically, it was one of the reasons the property sat on the market longer than expected. The previous owner had completely neglected it. Half the cedar boards looked gray from weather damage. Sections leaned slightly toward the alley behind the property, and parts of the old stain had peeled so badly the wood looked sunburned. Most buyers probably saw a repair bill. I saw a project that first summer. I spent nearly every weekend rebuilding sections of it myself, pressure washing old mildew, replacing warped boards one at a time, renting a post auger after discovering 2 supports had started rotting underground. I even watched tutorial videos late at night trying to figure out the best way to seal cedar properly, without making it look overly glossy. By August, I'd spent close to $3,000 between materials, tools, and stain alone. But standing in the backyard afterward actually felt good. The fence finally looked clean and solid, warm cedar color, straight lines, smooth finish that reflected sunlight in the evenings. It made the yard feel private in a way apartments never did. That mattered more to me than I probably admitted out loud. Most homeowners don't realize property line disputes get messy fast in HOA neighborhoods, because people start assuming shared visibility means shared ownership. But before replacing the fence, I'd already checked the county survey attached to my closing paperwork. Every section sat completely inside my property line by several inches. It wasn't a shared fence legally. Maintenance, repairs, and liability all fell entirely on me. Which was exactly why the situation with Patricia started bothering me so quickly. At first, it honestly seemed harmless. I came home one afternoon and noticed 2 beach towels hanging over the far corner of the fence separating my yard from Patricia Collins' property. They dripped a little water onto the grass, but I barely thought about it. Patricia waved from across the yard and casually said her dryer had stopped working. I told her it wasn't a big deal. Looking back, that was probably the moment the whole thing started. Patricia had lived in Maple Ridge longer than almost anyone else on the street. She was in her late 50s, always dressed like she was heading to a country club lunch, and somehow seemed to know everything happening in the neighborhood, before anyone else did. If somebody left their trash bins visible too long after pickup day, Patricia noticed. If someone's holiday decorations stayed up past HOA deadlines, Patricia noticed that too. And eventually, everybody figured out the same thing. If Patricia noticed something, the HOA usually noticed it right afterward. She wasn't technically the entire board, but she acted like the neighborhood operated through her personally. A lot of residents tolerated it because Maple Ridge really was quiet compared to most subdivisions nearby. People figured dealing with a strict AOA was the trade-off for clean streets and rising property values. I mostly stayed out of it. I paid my dues on time, kept my lawn cut. Didn't bother anybody for a while. Patricia treated me the same way most HOA presidents treat invisible homeowners. Friendly enough when necessary, slightly cold otherwise. Then the laundry started appearing more often, not huge loads at first. Just small things. A towel here, a swimsuit there, sometimes a pair of jeans hanging across the upper boards for an hour or two in the afternoon sun. Patricia always acted casual about it, like the fence existed halfway for neighborhood convenience anyway. One Saturday morning, I walked outside carrying coffee, and found several damp bath towels stretched across nearly 8 feet of cedar. That was the first time irritation really hit me. The stain had darkened underneath the wet fabric. Tiny streams of water slowly rolled down the wood grain, leaving streaks across panels I'd spent entire weekends restoring by hand. Patricia stood in her backyard clipping clothespins onto a bedsheet, while talking on the phone like none of it was unusual. I remember just standing there quietly for a second, not angry yet, just confused by how comfortable she seemed using someone else's property without asking. The weirdest part about HOA neighborhoods is how quickly repeated behavior starts feeling official if nobody challenges it. People assume routine equals permission. And Patricia clearly believed routine was already on her side. I took a slow sip of coffee and looked across the fence while another towel dripped onto the cedar. That was the moment I started realizing the problem probably wasn't going away on its own. Over the next few weeks, the laundry situation somehow turned into a routine. That was the part that bothered me most. Not the towels themselves, not even the water damage at first. It was how normal Patricia acted while doing it. Every couple of days, I'd come home from work and find something hanging over the fence again. Damp jeans, bath towels, kids' clothes once, an entire set of queen-sized bedsheets, stretched almost the full width of the back section facing her yard. The fence slowly stopped feeling like mine. Patricia never asked anymore either. At some point, she'd apparently decided permission had already been established. Most evenings, I'd notice fresh water streaks running down the cedar while unloading tools from my truck after work. The dark marks started appearing faster than before. Areas near the top rails stayed damp for hours, especially after humid days. The stain I'd carefully sealed the previous summer no longer looked even across the boards. The difference stood out immediately if you knew where to look. And unfortunately, I knew exactly where to look, because I'd spent months rebuilding the thing myself. One Saturday morning, I walked outside after a rainstorm and immediately noticed sections of the upper wood grain starting to fade unevenly beneath where towels usually hung. The cedar felt damp even though the rain had stopped hours earlier. I pressed my thumb lightly against one section and could already feel the protective finish weakening. That was the moment the repair costs started running through my head again. New stain, sanding, replacement boards if moisture got deep enough into the grain. I remember just standing there in silence holding my coffee while staring at wet fabric, hanging across half the fence line. Meanwhile, Patricia's grandchildren ran around her backyard tossing clothespins into a plastic bucket, like everything happening was completely normal. Patricia looked over and smiled casually. "Morning, Daniel," like we were discussing weather. I nodded back because I honestly still wasn't trying to start a conflict. That's the strange thing people don't understand about HOA neighborhoods. Most residents avoid confrontation for as long as possible, because once neighbor disputes become public, everybody ends up hearing about it. And in Maple Ridge, news traveled faster than Amazon deliveries. So instead of arguing, I started paying closer attention. I noticed Patricia only used my side of the fence because it got stronger afternoon sunlight than the fencing behind her own patio. I noticed she spread heavier blankets across the center sections, where the cedar rails were strongest. I noticed the routine became more aggressive on weekends, especially after large family gatherings. Little details started sticking out once I stopped ignoring them. The biggest change, though, was Patricia's attitude. At first, she'd acted apologetic. Now she acted comfortable. One afternoon, I overheard her talking to another neighbor while pinning towels across the fence. "It's not like he's using that side of the yard anyway." I stayed inside the kitchen when I heard that. Not because I was scared to confront her, because I wanted to hear the rest. Patricia laughed lightly and adjusted one of the towels before continuing. "Honestly, people get way too possessive in these HOA communities. We all share visibility back here." That sentence stuck with me for the rest of the night. Shared visibility, like my property existed halfway for neighborhood convenience. That was around the time I started documenting everything. Most homeowners don't realize documentation becomes extremely important. Once HOA disputes turn procedural, verbal complaints disappear. Casual conversations get denied. But photos with timestamps usually don't. So I started quietly building a folder on my phone. Nothing dramatic, just evidence. I photographed water stains spreading beneath the upper rails. I documented damp fabric hanging over the same sections repeatedly. I took close-up shots showing peeling sealant near the top boards. Every few days, I snapped another picture from the patio, at roughly the same angle at first. Even that felt excessive, like I was overreacting to laundry. But the longer it continued, the more I realized the actual problem wasn't fabric. It was entitlement. And entitlement tends to grow when nobody pushes back against it. The situation got noticeably worse toward the end of July. Patricia's dryer apparently broke again, except this time the laundry started appearing almost daily. Large comforters draped across multiple panels, heavy towels soaking into the cedar for entire afternoons. Once, I came home during a heat wave and found several rugs hanging over the fence with dirty water dripping directly down the wood. That one genuinely irritated me. I walked outside immediately, and Patricia looked up from her patio chair, without even seeming embarrassed anymore. "Oh, don't worry," she said casually. "They'll be dry soon," like she was reassuring me about parking space. I looked at the fence for a second before answering. "It's damaging the wood." Patricia waved her hand dismissively. "It's outdoor fencing, Daniel. It gets wet." Then she went back to scrolling on her phone. That conversation sat in my head for the rest of the evening. Not because she disagreed with me, because she genuinely didn't seem to think the distinction mattered anymore. Private property had somehow become community utility space in her mind. Over the next few days, I started noticing something else too. Other neighbors saw it happening. People walking dogs slowed down near the fence line. A couple across the street glanced toward Patricia's backyard, while loading groceries into their SUV. One older man mowing his lawn actually paused for a second, staring at the bedsheets hanging across my cedar panels, before continuing without saying anything. Nobody wanted involvement, but people noticed, and once I realized that, the situation started feeling less temporary. This wasn't just an annoying neighbor habit anymore. It was becoming an accepted routine inside the neighborhood. One evening after work, I stood in the backyard staring at fresh moisture stains spreading beneath another row of towels, while Patricia laughed with someone on speakerphone behind the fence. I pulled out my phone quietly and took 3 more pictures. That was the first night I started wondering whether being polite was actually making the situation worse. By the second week of August, I finally decided I needed to address the situation directly. Not through the HOA, not through complaints. Just a normal conversation between neighbors. Honestly, part of me still believed Patricia would back off, once I explained how much damage the moisture was causing. Most reasonable people stop pushing, once they realize they're costing someone money. So one Saturday morning, I waited until she was outside watering plants near the patio, and walked over to the fence calmly. No anger. No confrontation. I even remember intentionally leaving my phone inside, because I didn't want the interaction to feel hostile. "Hey Patricia," I said, "do you have a second?" She looked up with that same relaxed smile she always used, whenever the laundry was hanging across my fence. "Sure." I pointed toward several damp towels draped over the cedar behind her. "I wanted to ask if you could stop using the fence for drying clothes." The smile faded slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to notice. I explained the moisture problem as calmly as I could. The cedar stain. The water damage. The amount of repair work I'd already put into restoring the fence the previous summer. I even mentioned that some sections were already starting to weaken near the top rails. Patricia listened without interrupting, but I could tell almost immediately she wasn't taking the conversation seriously. When I finished, she gave a small shrug. "Daniel, it's an outdoor fence." "I know," I said carefully. "But constant moisture still damages the wood." She looked back toward the towels. "They're only up for a few hours." I nodded slowly. "I understand. I'm just asking you not to use it anymore." For a couple seconds, Patricia didn't answer. Then she laughed softly. Not a loud laugh. Worse. The kind people use when they think someone is overreacting. "You're being a little territorial about this," she said. "The fence faces both properties." That sentence immediately irritated me more than I expected, because technically, it didn't. Most homeowners assume boundary fences automatically count as shared structures, especially in HOA communities. But property surveys matter more than visibility. My fence sat entirely inside my lot line, which legally made it private property even if both yards could see it. I didn't bother explaining all that yet. Instead, I kept the conversation simple. "I'm not trying to make this into a problem," I told her. "I'd just appreciate it if you stopped hanging things on it." Patricia clipped another towel onto the upper rail while I was still standing there. "That seems a little extreme." That was the moment I realized the conversation probably wasn't going anywhere. Still, I stayed calm. "I'm serious, Patricia." She sighed dramatically, like I was creating unnecessary stress for her weekend. "Fine," she said. "I'll try." And even then, I already knew she didn't mean it. The next afternoon, the laundry came back. Bigger this time, 2 comforters, several heavy towels, a set of damp jeans hanging directly across the same upper panels I'd pointed out the day before. I stared at it through the kitchen window for a solid 10 seconds before even setting my work bag down. That was the first moment the situation stopped feeling careless. Now it felt intentional. 3 days later, I came home from work and found an Orange HOA Notice taped to my front door. Maple Ridge Homeowners Association courtesy violation. Notice the complaint listed visible exterior discoloration, affecting neighborhood appearance standards. The fence. My fence. The same fence Patricia had been soaking with wet laundry for weeks. Failure to resolve the issue within 14 days could result in formal hearings and weekly fines. Inside the house, I read the notice 3 more times sitting at the kitchen table. The language sounded intentionally vague. No mention of moisture damage, no mention of laundry, just visible deterioration inconsistent with community appearance standards. That's another thing most homeowners don't realize until they deal with HOS personally. Violation notices are often written broadly on purpose. Broad wording gives boards flexibility later, if disputes escalate. The towels returned immediately after our conversation. Then suddenly, the HOA noticed fence discoloration. For the first time since moving into Maple Ridge, I started feeling something worse than irritation. I felt cornered, because now the same person causing the damage also seemed connected to the organization, threatening to fine me for it. And once that realization settled in, the entire situation started looking very different. That orange notice changed the entire way I looked at the situation. Up until then, I'd still been treating Patricia like an annoying neighbor. Now I started realizing I was dealing with someone who understood exactly how HOA pressure worked, and honestly that bothered me more than the laundry itself. For the next couple days, I barely touched the fence at all. I'd come home from work, look at the violation notice sitting on the kitchen counter, then walk straight past the backyard, without even checking the damage anymore. Because the problem clearly wasn't going to disappear through another conversation. The HOA had officially entered the picture. One Tuesday night after work, I sat down at my kitchen table around 11, with the entire Maple Ridge HOA handbook spread open beside my laptop. The binder itself looked ridiculous. Nearly 200 pages of bylaws, architectural standards, landscaping regulations, parking restrictions, holiday decoration rules, and enforcement procedures. Most homeowners probably never read more than 10 pages of it after moving in. I definitely hadn't. At least not until that point. Outside, Rain tapped lightly against the kitchen windows, while I flipped through section after section, looking for anything related to fencing violations. The whole process felt frustrating at first, because HOA documents are written in the driest language imaginable. Half the sentences sounded like they'd been copied from insurance paperwork, but the longer I read, the more patterns I started noticing. And once I noticed those patterns, the entire system started looking different. Most homeowners think HOA boards can basically do whatever they want. That's how organizations like Maple Ridge maintain leverage in the first place. People assume fighting back automatically costs more time and money than compliance. But the funny part was, the HOA rules applied to the board too, especially procedural rules. That was the first thing I learned. Violation notices had deadlines, inspection requirements, documentation standards, hearing procedures, appeal windows, architectural review timelines. The HOA couldn't just invent rules in real time, because somebody on the board got irritated, at least not legally around midnight. I dug out the original property survey from my closing paperwork and spread it across the table beside the HOA binder. That document changed everything. The fence line sat entirely inside my property boundary by almost 6 inches along the rear section near Patricia's yard. Not shared property, not HOA, owned improvement space. Mine, completely mine. I leaned back in the kitchen chair staring at the survey for a long time after realizing that, because suddenly Patricia's language about shared visibility started sounding a lot less innocent. She either didn't understand the distinction herself, or she understood it perfectly, and assumed I didn't. Neither possibility made me feel better. I started reading through the architectural modification section next. That was where things got interesting. Maple Ridge required homeowners to submit ARC requests before making visible exterior changes. Paint colors, patio covers, landscaping structures, fence modifications, basically anything neighbors could see from the street or adjacent lots. At first, I assumed that meant I was trapped. Then I reached section 8.3. I actually reread the paragraph twice, just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. Architectural requests required board response within 30 days of submission. If no formal response was issued within that period, the request automatically entered conditional approval status, unless specifically delayed in writing. I sat there staring at that sentence while the rain continued hitting the windows. That clause existed because HOA boards move slowly. The rule prevented applications from sitting ignored forever. But in practice, it created a loophole, especially for homeowners patient enough to follow procedure carefully. That was the first moment my frustration started turning into something else. I stopped thinking about arguments after that. Stopped thinking about Patricia entirely. Honestly. Instead, I started thinking procedurally. I printed copies of the violation notice, organized my photos by date, created a folder on my laptop with timestamps showing repeated moisture damage across the fence. Then I added screenshots from county survey records, confirming the exact property boundaries. None of it felt emotional anymore. It felt methodical. That shift surprised me a little. A week earlier, I'd been standing in the backyard angry about towels. Now I was building documentation timelines at 1 in the morning, like I was preparing for an insurance dispute, and strangely enough, that made me calmer. The next evening after work, I walked the entire fence line slowly with a measuring tape for the first time. Not because I fully knew what I planned to do yet, but because ideas were starting to form. I measured height clearances, rail spacing, distance from the patio sightlines. I even checked local county fencing guidelines online afterward, just to compare them against Maple Ridge regulations. That's when I realized something important. The HOA rules focused heavily on appearance, not functionality. As long as modifications stayed within approved height limits and matched neighborhood aesthetic standards, the board cared far more about visual consistency than practical use. And suddenly, Patricia's entire setup started looking vulnerable. I remember standing outside near sunset running my hand across the top rail while neighbors watered lawns further down the street. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about the damage anymore. I was thinking about solutions. Real ones. Quiet ones. The kind that didn't require yelling at anybody. Inside the house later that night, I opened the HOA portal and started filling out an architectural request form. Not emotionally, carefully. Every measurement precise. Every material description neutral and professional. By the time I finally closed my laptop, Patricia still thought she was dealing with a frustrated neighbor arguing about towels. She had no idea the situation had already become procedural. The strange part was how calm I became after submitting the ARC request. Not happy. Not confident yet. Just focused. For weeks, every time I walked into the backyard, I'd immediately look for towels hanging across the fence. I'd check for fresh moisture stains, water streaks, dark patches in the cedar finish. Now I found myself paying attention to completely different things. Measurements, sightlines, angles. My request submission the following morning with an odd. That weekend, she tried twice to bait me into another conversation. The first time happened Saturday morning while I was trimming hedges near the driveway. She walked over carrying an empty laundry basket and leaned casually against the mailbox. "Haven't seen you outside much lately," she said. I kept trimming without stopping. "Busy week." She nodded slowly. "You still upset about the fence?" The question sounded light, but something underneath it felt more cautious than before. Like she was trying to figure out whether I planned to escalate the situation further. Technically, that wasn't even a lie anymore. I wasn't upset. I was planning. Patricia stood there another few seconds waiting for more conversation, but I went back to trimming hedges quietly until she finally walked away. That seemed to bother her more than arguing ever had. Over the next several days, I started spending more time outside after work with a measuring tape and a small notebook. Nothing dramatic, just slow walks along the fence line during the evenings, while sprinklers clicked across nearby lawns and cicadas buzzed through the trees behind the subdivision. Maple Ridge stayed incredibly quiet around sunset. Garage doors closing, dogs barking somewhere in the distance, kids riding bikes near the cul-de-sac before streetlights turned on. And in the middle of all that suburban routine, I kept measuring sections of cedar like I was preparing for something nobody else understood yet. Which honestly wasn't far from the truth. I checked fence height limits against HOA guidelines 3 separate times, because I didn't want a single technical mistake slowing things down later. I measured the spacing between support posts, calculated viewing angles from Patricia's patio. Even the top rail width mattered now. The more precise I became, the calmer I felt. That surprised me. Most people probably imagine revenge feeling emotional, but the version building in my head felt almost mechanical. Quiet, controlled. One evening after work, a white contractor truck pulled into my driveway just before dinner. The driver stepped out carrying several sample materials, while Patricia immediately appeared outside less than 2 minutes later, pretending to water flowers near the fence. That alone almost made me laugh. I stood in the driveway reviewing material finishes with the contractor, while Patricia kept glancing over every few seconds from her yard. Not obvious enough to call out. Just obvious enough to notice. The contractor asked whether the modification needed to meet HOA visual standards. "Unfortunately," I said. He grinned. "Got one of those neighborhoods, huh?" I nodded. "You have no idea." After about 20 minutes, the contractor left behind a few sample pieces for me to compare against the existing cedar finish. Sleek composite materials, angled topper designs, different stain options that matched Maple Ridge aesthetic requirements closely enough to avoid attention, or at least official attention. That night, I laid everything across the kitchen table beside the HOA handbook and studied the dimensions again while eating leftover takeout. The solution was starting to come together, but I still hadn't fully committed yet. Partly because I wanted the timing perfect, and partly because I understood something Patricia didn't. Once the installation happened, there wouldn't really be a way to reverse it. That realization made patience important. The following Tuesday, I received another HOA email acknowledging my architectural request had been forwarded for board review. No rejection, no concerns, just procedural confirmation. I reread the message twice anyway. Then I checked the calendar day 6, which meant the clock was already running. Most homeowners never pay attention to HOA timelines, because they assume the board controls every stage of the process indefinitely. But procedural deadlines matter more than personalities once documentation enters the picture. And Patricia still thought this was just a neighbor disagreement. That disconnect was becoming increasingly obvious. A few days later, I came home from work and noticed no laundry hanging across the fence for the first time in nearly 2 months. The cedar sat completely clear in the evening sunlight. No towels, no blankets, nothing. At first I thought Patricia had finally stopped. Then I noticed her standing near the patio watching me unload tools from my truck. Not angry, watching, trying to read me. That was the moment I realized something else had changed. Patricia wasn't comfortable anymore either. She didn't know exactly what I was doing, but she knew I'd stopped reacting emotionally, and somehow that uncertainty seemed to bother her more than confrontation ever had. Later that night, I walked the fence line one more time after dark, while soft patio lights glowed across neighboring backyards. I ran my hand slowly across the top rail, mentally checking measurements again. Everything was ready. Now I was just waiting for the right moment to move. 30 days sounds long until you're waiting for an HOA board to respond. By the 3rd week, I checked the Maple Ridge portal almost every evening after work. Nothing. No rejection. No request for revisions. No additional review notice. Just silence. And the quieter the HOA became, the calmer I got. Patricia, meanwhile, seemed to be moving in the opposite direction. She started watching the backyard constantly. Not openly enough to accuse her of anything, but every time I stepped outside with measurements or material samples, she somehow ended up near the patio within a few minutes, watering flowers that didn't need watering, rearranging outdoor cushions, wiping down patio furniture already clean. The funny part was, she clearly wanted information without directly asking for it, because asking questions would mean admitting something had changed, and something definitely had. On day 28, a flatbed delivery truck rolled slowly into Maple Ridge, just after 8 in the morning. I'd scheduled the delivery intentionally on a Friday, because most people in the neighborhood worked from home at least part of the day, which meant everyone noticed the truck almost immediately. The driver unloaded long wrapped sections of matte composite material onto my driveway, while I signed paperwork near the garage. Across the street, curtains moved. A garage door opened halfway. Patricia appeared outside less than 60 seconds later, right on schedule. She stood near the fence pretending to untangle a garden hose, while watching the entire delivery process from the corner of her yard. I almost respected the commitment at that point. The materials themselves didn't look dramatic. That was intentional too. Sleek cedar, toned composite toppers, clean finish, modern design. Nothing flashy enough to violate Maple Ridge appearance standards. Actually, they looked expensive enough that several neighbors probably assumed the HOA approved them already. Which technically wasn't untrue. Silence mattered. Most homeowners never realize HOA architectural systems often work on procedural approval, not emotional approval. Boards can dislike a project personally, and still lose the ability to block it if they miss response deadlines correctly outlined in their own bylaws. That's why documentation and timing matter so much. And by day 31, Maple Ridge still hadn't issued a response. Which meant Section 8.3 quietly activated exactly the way I hoped it would. Conditional approval. No drama, no courtroom moment, just procedure. Saturday morning, I started installation just after sunrise before the August heat settled in. Maple Ridge felt unusually still that early. Sprinklers hissed across nearby lawns, while birds moved through the trees lining the back retention pond behind the subdivision. The streetlights had only shut off maybe 20 minutes earlier. I laid out tools carefully across the driveway and started carrying the composite sections into the backyard one at a time. That's when Patricia finally approached the fence directly. "What exactly are you building?" she asked. Her tone sounded casual, but only on the surface. I tightened a mounting bracket against the upper rail before answering. "Fence modification." She frowned slightly. "Did the HOA approve this?" I wiped sweat off my forehead and grabbed another bracket from the toolbox. "I submitted everything through ARC." Technically, that answer told her exactly what she needed to know, which was why she stopped talking immediately afterward. Because if Patricia understood Maple Ridge bylaws half as well as I suspected she did, then she also understood what HOA's silence meant after 30 days. And judging by the expression on her face, she absolutely understood. The actual installation took most of the weekend. Not difficult work, just detailed. Every topper section had to align evenly across the existing cedar panels, without exceeding height restrictions. I checked measurements constantly, because even small visual inconsistencies would attract attention in Maple Ridge. Especially now, by Saturday afternoon, several sections were already complete. The transformation looked subtle at first glance, but very different up close. The angled composite toppers extended upward from the fence, at a smooth slope, facing outward toward Patricia's side. Modern-looking, clean, almost decorative, if you didn't pay attention too carefully. But the angle itself changed everything. There was no flat surface left anymore. Nothing could rest across the top rail naturally. Fabric would slide immediately. Exactly like I intended. Late Saturday evening, I stepped back across the yard holding a drill, while the sunset reflected softly across the new composite finish. For the first time since moving into Maple Ridge, the fence actually looked better than before the conflict started. Cleaner, sharper, more intentional, and best of all, completely compliant. The next morning, Patricia walked outside carrying a basket of wet laundry. She froze for a second when she saw the finished sections in daylight. Not angry yet, confused, like someone staring at a locked door that used to stay open. I kept working quietly near the final corner section, while she stood there holding damp towels against her hip. Neither of us said anything, but the silence felt different now. For weeks, Patricia had acted like the fence naturally belonged halfway to her. Now she was looking at it like she suddenly realized she might have misunderstood the situation completely. That realization hadn't fully hit her yet. But it was getting close, and standing there in the backyard tightening the last mounting bracket into place, I realized something too. For the first time since the whole mess started, I was actually looking forward to the next laundry day. Monday afternoon ended up being hotter than usual for late August. By the time I pulled into the driveway after work, heat was still rising off the pavement in waves, and most of Maple Ridge looked half asleep under the sun. Lawn sprinklers clicked across front yards, while delivery vans crawled slowly through the subdivision dropping off packages before dinner. I grabbed my tool bag from the truck and immediately noticed Patricia in the backyard. Laundry basket beside her feet, wet towels already draped over one arm. I almost smiled. Not because I wanted a fight, because after weeks of stress, I finally knew exactly what was about to happen. I walked through the house calmly and stepped onto the patio just as Patricia approached the fence carrying the first towel. She hesitated slightly, looking at the new angled topper. Then she tried anyway. The towel lasted maybe half a second before sliding straight off the composite surface and dropping into the grass on her side of the yard. Patricia stared at it, then looked back at the fence, then picked it up and tried again. Same result. The towel slipped down immediately like it had hit ice. I leaned quietly against the patio railing holding a glass of water while pretending not to watch. Patricia frowned and adjusted the towel more carefully this time, trying to wedge one corner against the angled surface. The fabric slid off again. By the third attempt, I could already feel the situation turning. Not dramatic, just inevitable. A couple walking dogs along the retention path behind the properties slowed down slightly, watching Patricia wrestle with a bath towel against a fence clearly designed to reject it. One of them actually glanced toward me sitting calmly on the patio before continuing down the trail. Patricia finally grabbed a heavier blanket from the laundry basket and threw it across the fence with more force. For a split second, it stayed balanced. Then gravity took over. The entire blanket slowly folded sideways before sliding off the composite topper and collapsing into the grass in a wet heap. That was the moment I had to look away to hide a smile. Not because Patricia looked ridiculous, because the solution worked exactly the way I planned it to. Quietly, perfectly. Patricia looked over at me for the first time. "What did you do to the fence?" I set the glass down beside the patio chair. "ARC-approved modification." Her expression tightened immediately. "You built this to stop me." I shrugged lightly. "I built it to protect the wood." Technically, both statements were true. Patricia stepped closer to the fence holding a damp towel against her chest. "This is completely unnecessary." I looked toward the cedar panels. No, the water damage was unnecessary. For a second she didn't answer, and I could tell something important had finally clicked in her head. The situation was no longer operating on social pressure. It was operating on procedure now, and procedure favored whoever prepared better. That realization clearly frustrated her. "You could have just talked to me again," she said. I almost laughed at that. We both knew I already had. Instead, I kept my voice calm. "I did." Patricia looked back toward the angled topper running across the fence line. The design honestly looked cleaner than the original cedar alone. Modern, professional, intentional enough that it blended naturally with higher-end properties around Maple Ridge, which created another problem for her. Complaining about it publicly would require explaining why she suddenly cared so much about my fence. And neither of us wanted that conversation happening in front of neighbors, especially because people were definitely noticing now. A teenager riding a bike slowed down near the sidewalk, staring at the fence transformation before continuing toward the cul-de-sac. Across the street, someone unloading groceries glanced toward Patricia standing beside several towels scattered across the grass. Nobody stopped to interfere, but everyone understood something unusual was happening. Patricia tried one last time with a smaller hand towel. The fabric slid down instantly. That seemed to break whatever confidence she still had left. She tossed the towel back into the basket harder than necessary. "This is petty," she muttered. I looked at the fence quietly for a second before answering. Replacing damaged cedar every year would have been expensive. That was another thing most HOA boards rarely think about when enforcing appearance standards. Liability and maintenance costs still belong to the homeowner if the structure sits fully inside the property line, which means selective enforcement gets risky once documentation exists, showing someone repeatedly caused the same damage being cited by the HOA. And Patricia knew I had documentation. I could see it on her face. That nervous calculation people make when they realize a situation might not go their way anymore. She looked toward the fence one more time before finally gathering the fallen towels back into the basket. For the first time in weeks, there was no confidence in her posture, no casual entitlement, just frustration. And underneath that frustration, embarrassment. Not public humiliation, not movie scene embarrassment. The quieter kind. The kind that happens when someone realizes their behavior looked reasonable, only because nobody challenged it before. Patricia walked back toward her patio without another word. A few minutes later, she came outside carrying a collapsible drying rack I'd never seen before, and started setting it up near the corner of her yard. I sat down slowly in the patio chair, watching the evening sunlight hit the new fence topper while soft wind moved through the trees behind the retention pond. No towels hanging over the cedar, no water dripping down the rails, no arguments. Just silence. And honestly, after everything that happened, the silence felt better than revenge ever could. The weird thing about neighborhood drama is how fast people stop talking about it directly, while still talking about it constantly. By Wednesday, nobody in Maple Ridge mentioned the fence situation openly, but everybody clearly knew. You could feel it in the small pauses during conversations, the extra glances toward the backyard while people walked dogs near the retention trail, the way neighbors suddenly seemed very interested in fence modifications after ignoring mine for years. Even the atmosphere around Patricia changed. Not dramatically. Nobody turned against her overnight. That's not how HOA neighborhoods work. People in places like Maple Ridge usually avoid direct conflict whenever possible, because everybody still has to live next to each other afterward. So instead of confrontation, social pressure shifts quietly, subtly, and once I noticed that shift starting, it became impossible to ignore. A few days after the laundry incident, I was staining a small section of cedar near the gate, when my neighbor Tom stopped near the property line, holding a trash bin. Tom lived 2 houses down, and mostly kept to himself. Retired UPS driver, always wore old baseball caps and white sneakers no matter the season. He looked toward the angled fence topper for a second before nodding. "Actually looks pretty good." "Thanks," I said. Tom hesitated another second before lowering his voice slightly. "Honestly, I'm surprised it took someone this long to push back on Patricia." That caught me off guard a little. Not because he said it. Because he said it so casually. Like the entire neighborhood had already accepted the situation long before I realized how visible it was. I set the stain brush down carefully. "You noticed the laundry thing too?" Tom laughed once. "Daniel, everybody noticed." Then he pointed toward the fence. "She used to do the same thing to the Hendersons years ago with garden hoses." I stared at him for a second. "What?" Tom shrugged. "Not exactly the same situation, but she's always had a habit of treating shared visibility like shared ownership." That phrase stuck in my head immediately. Shared visibility, the exact same wording Patricia used herself. Which meant this probably wasn't the first time she'd pushed boundaries assuming nobody would challenge her. Tom wheeled his trash bin toward the curb before stopping again. "For what it's worth," he added, "the fence looks better now than it did before." Then he walked off without saying anything else. That conversation changed the way I viewed the neighborhood afterward. Until then, I'd mostly assumed people saw the situation as a petty disagreement between neighbors. But apparently most residents understood exactly what had happened. They just weren't interested in getting involved publicly, and honestly, I understood that too. HOA communities create strange social dynamics, because people learn quickly that visibility matters almost as much as rules themselves. Nobody wants to become the center of neighborhood attention if they can avoid it. Which explained why Patricia became noticeably quieter after the installation. The laundry never touched the fence again, not once. Instead, a collapsible drying rack started appearing near the back corner of her patio every afternoon. She set it up quickly, used it silently, then folded it away before evening. Efficient, temporary, almost like she hoped people would stop associating her with the whole situation entirely. But the social shift had already happened. One Friday evening, I checked the HOA portal again and noticed something interesting. The violation notice against my fence had quietly disappeared from the active enforcement page. No apology, no explanation, just gone. Honestly, that felt Most HOA boards avoid admitting mistakes directly, because formal acknowledgments create paper trails. And paper trails become problems later, if homeowners start questioning inconsistent enforcement standards. That's another thing people rarely realize about HOA systems. Selective enforcement becomes dangerous for boards once documentation starts showing inconsistent treatment between residents, especially when property damage and liability overlap with aesthetic complaints. And thanks to Patricia, I had documentation for everything now. Photos, dates, survey records, ARC submissions, timeline records. The entire situation existed in neat digital folders on my laptop, whether the HOA wanted to revisit it or not. Which probably explained why they suddenly lost interest in the fence. One evening near sunset, I noticed Patricia standing alone beside the drying rack folding towels carefully, while several neighbors walked the retention path nearby. Nobody stared openly. Nobody laughed. Patricia no longer carried herself with the same casual certainty she had earlier that summer either, and weirdly enough, I almost felt bad for her for about 5 seconds. Then I remembered the orange violation notice taped to my front door. That feeling passed pretty quickly. The biggest surprise, honestly, was how normal everything started feeling afterward. Maple Ridge settled back into its usual rhythm almost immediately. Lawn crews every Thursday morning, kids riding bikes near the cul-de-sac after dinner, package deliveries stacked near front porches, sprinklers running before sunrise, and in the middle of all that routine, the fence simply existed now as part of the neighborhood landscape. Clean, dry, untouchable. Exactly the way it should have been from the beginning. One Saturday afternoon, I sat on the patio drinking iced tea while late summer wind moved through the trees behind the retention pond. Patricia was outside too, quietly folding laundry onto the drying rack, without looking toward the fence once. No arguments. No towels hanging across the cedar. No HOA notices taped to my door. Just boundaries, finally respected because they were finally enforced. By September, the whole situation had mostly faded into routine, which was exactly what I wanted. No more HOA notices. No more awkward conversations. No more damp towels hanging across the cedar every time I came home from work. Just normal life again. The fence settled naturally into the backyard like it had always belonged there. The composite topper weathered surprisingly well under the late summer sun, and the cedar underneath, finally had time to dry properly, without constant moisture soaking into the grain. A few weeks after the installation, I spent an entire Saturday morning lightly sanding and resealing the damaged upper sections near the center panels. The difference was immediate. Fresh stain restored the deeper cedar color, while sunlight reflected cleanly across the repaired finish. Most of the discoloration that triggered the HOA notice disappeared, completely after the first coat. Honestly, the fence looked better than it had even before Patricia started using it for laundry. That part still made me laugh a little. The violation that nearly turned into fines ended up pushing me to improve the entire structure instead. And because everything stayed fully compliant, the HOA couldn't really say much afterward. Not that they seemed interested anymore. Maple Ridge returned to its normal suburban rhythm almost completely by then. Football games playing from garage televisions on weekends, neighbors walking dogs after dinner, while sprinklers clicked quietly across front lawns, Amazon vans stopping every 20 minutes, the usual. And somewhere inside all that ordinary routine, the tension finally disappeared. One evening near the end of September, I sat outside after work with a plate of takeout balanced on the patio table, while the sun dropped behind the retention pond trees. The backyard felt different now. Not bigger, not quieter, exactly. Just mine again. That's the part I don't think Patricia understood in the beginning. Most homeowners aren't obsessive about property because they're territorial for no reason. It's because maintenance takes time. Privacy takes effort. Boundaries only stay healthy if people respect them consistently. And once those boundaries start getting ignored, even small things slowly become exhausting. That exhaustion had disappeared now. No more checking the fence every evening. No more documenting water damage. No more wondering whether another ODE letter would appear taped to my front door. Just peace. Across the yard, Patricia quietly folded laundry onto the drying rack, without looking toward the fence once. We still waved occasionally if we crossed paths near the driveway. Neither of us brought up the situation again. Honestly, that was probably for the best. Not every neighborhood conflict needs some dramatic final confrontation. Most people eventually adapt once consequences become inconvenient enough. And that's exactly what happened here. The topper didn't punish Patricia. It simply removed the option she kept abusing. That difference mattered to me, because in the end, I never really wanted revenge. I just wanted my fence back. One cool evening after sunset, I turned on the patio lights and looked across the clean cedar panels, glowing softly under the warm bulbs, while crickets buzzed through the trees behind the subdivision. No towels, no water stains, no tension, just a backyard finally feeling peaceful again. And after the kind of summer Maple Ridge had put me through, that peace felt worth every single bracket I installed. After all that, I'm honestly curious how many people have dealt with neighbors who slowly started treating private property like shared space, just because nobody stopped them early, especially in HOA neighborhoods, where everyone tries to avoid conflict until things get completely ridiculous. So if you've ever had a situation like that, let me know in the comments. I read more of these stories than you'd probably expect, and if you enjoyed this one, feel free to subscribe. There's apparently no shortage of HOA drama in suburban America. This story was fictional but inspired by common neighborhood and HOA conflicts people deal with every day.